While the whole world kept talking about the Super Mustang or Corvette in 1990s America, there were once strange, bold machines so far ahead of their time that almost no one fully understood their value back then. It was a period when Japanese cars were rising. Detroit had begun experimenting with bold ideas, and in the middle of that wave, many great cars quietly vanished from the public's memory. Today, we're going to look back at 10 of the most astonishing forgotten cars of the 1990s. At number 1 is the 1992 to 1997 Subaru SVX. At a time when most sports cars in America still stayed loyal to familiar coupe shapes, Subaru created something that looked like a concept car that had just driven straight onto the street. The SVX did not have the muscular look of a Mustang, nor did it carry the speed reputation of a Supra. Instead, it appeared with a low, wide, smooth, and unusual shape to the point that with just a quick glance, people knew this was not an ordinary Subaru. What made the SVX most unforgettable was its unique window within a window glass design, a detail penned by the legendary Giorgetto Giugiaro. This window within a window style made the car look like a spaceship from the future, especially in the context of the early 1990s, when most cars on the road were still fairly boxy and conservative in their design language. Beneath the body was a 3.3-liter flat-six engine delivering a driving character that was very different, smooth, refined, solid, and more premium feeling than many people would expect when talking about Subaru. Combined with Subaru's famous AWD system, the SVX delivered confident stability at high speeds, feeling more like an elegant grand tourer than a coupe built purely to show off. At the time of its launch, Subaru was still seen by Americans as a practical, durable, and affordable brand. And yet the SVX was priced at about $28,000, equal to nearly $60,000 today. That was simply too high for a coupe wearing a Subaru badge in the early 1990s. Customers were not ready to pay that kind of money for a car that was this beautiful, this unusual, and this upscale from a brand they still were not used to seeing as luxurious. At number 2 is the 1990 to 1992 Oldsmobile Toronado Tropheo. At first glance, the Toronado Tropheo was not the kind of car that made people instantly go crazy. It did not have the sharp look of Japanese cars, nor did it carry the aggressive aura of traditional American muscle cars. Its design was rounded, restrained, and almost excessively formal and mature. But that very calmness hid a feature that at the time almost sounded like science fiction, the Visual Information Center, or VIC. At a time when most American cars still relied on physical buttons and familiar analog gauges, the Toronado Tropheo came equipped with a color CRT touchscreen to control a wide range of in-car functions. From the radio climate control and trip information to vehicle diagnostics, everything was brought together into one central electronic interface. Today that may sound normal, but in the early 1990s, this was the kind of technology that put this Oldsmobile far ahead of the crowd. And it was not just about technology. The Toronado Tropheo was also finished like a true luxury coupe. Leather upholstery, multi-way power seats, and a cabin focused more on comfort and convenience than excitement. But like so many cars on this list, the Toronado Tropheo suffered from a familiar problem. It was too advanced in the place buyers least expected. The technology inside the car went too far ahead, while the exterior design was not bold enough to tell the market that this was a breakthrough product. And then as the Oldsmobile brand slowly slid toward its end, cars like the Toronado Tropheo sank with it. The Oldsmobile name gradually lost its appeal, and the Tropheo was left behind as an experiment that came too early, too quietly, and was never flashy enough to be remembered by mainstream automotive history. At number 3 is the 1992 to 1994 Acura Vigor. In the early 1990s, Acura was in a very confident phase. They already had the Legend for customers who wanted spacious luxury, and the Integra for those who loved a youthful driving feel. And the Vigor appeared as the piece in between a sedan for those who wanted something more refined, more distinctive, and with a clearer mechanical personality than most cars in its segment. The Vigor's biggest distinguishing feature sat right under the hood. Instead of using a familiar V6 or a common four-cylinder, Acura fitted it with the G25A inline-5 engine and mounted it longitudinally in an arrangement that was highly unusual for a front-wheel drive sedan. That configuration alone was enough to make the Vigor stand out. But what people remembered most was not just its rarity, but the feeling it created. A 5-cylinder engine always has a very unique sound, not as perfectly rounded as a 6-cylinder, yet not as simple as a 4-cylinder. It produced an unusual growl, smooth, yet still carrying a bit of edge, as if the car were trying to say that it was refined, but never bland. On the road, the Vigor delivered a very interesting experience. It was not as large as the Legend, so the front end felt more agile and the steering responses felt sharper. but at the same time it still retained the smoothness and polish you would expect from an early 1990s Acura luxury model. But despite its interesting engineering and unique character, the Vigor was limited by a rather short wheelbase, which made the rear seat not truly spacious by the standards American customers wanted in a luxury sedan. In a market that placed great importance on space comfort and practicality, that was a weakness that was hard to ignore. When Acura later replaced it with the TL, a model that was easier to understand, roomier, and more in tune with mainstream taste, the Vigor was almost immediately pushed into obscurity. At number 4 is the 1992 to 1997 Infiniti J30. At a time when most luxury sedans still favored boxy, serious, and somewhat conservative lines, Infiniti introduced a car with a rounded flowing body and almost no clearly defined edges. The rear end tapered down dramatically, giving it the feel of a yacht more than a traditional executive sedan. That boat-tail design made the J30 stand out immediately. It did not try to look like a Mercedes, nor did it chase BMW's sporting philosophy. It chose to exist like an object that was almost sculptural. That boldness made the J30 a car that was very easy to love, or very easy to reject. But do not let that soft exterior fool you. Beneath that artistic body was a 3.0-liter V6 closely related to the engine that once appeared in the Nissan 300ZX, one of Nissan's greatest performance icons of that era. Of course, in the J30, this engine was tuned to serve a different character. It did not turn the car into a street racer, but it delivered a driving feel that was smooth, confident, and luxurious. Exactly like a high-end Japanese sedan, trying to prove that refinement could also come with personality. The problem was that the American market at the time was not truly ready for that kind of personality. Luxury sedan buyers in the early 1990s still preferred cars that looked substantial, conventional, and practical. Meanwhile, the J30 sacrificed quite a bit of usefulness in order to pursue its design shape. The deeply tapered rear made the trunk smaller than expected, significantly reducing practicality, a factor that was very important to American buyers. In other words, Infiniti had created a car whose exterior looked like an aesthetic statement. But the market at that time was looking for a luxury sedan that was easier to understand, roomier, and more safe in its styling taste. At number 5 is the 1989 to 1995 Ford Thunderbird Super Coupe. At first glance, the Super Coupe was not the kind of car that made an entire parking lot fall silent in amazement. It still kept the familiar Thunderbird shape, long, low, elegant, and carrying more of a grand tourer character than that of a pure street muscle car. But hidden beneath that somewhat restrained exterior was a very serious technology package, enough to make it one of the most interesting Fords of the early 1990s. The heart of this car was a 3.8-liter V6 paired with an Eaton M90 supercharger. That configuration alone was unusual enough in a time when American cars were still obsessed with cylinder count. Ford did not choose to add 2 more cylinders for prestige. They chose forced induction, creating an engine with quick response, thick torque, and a very full sense of acceleration right from the low rev range. It was not just powerful on paper, but powerful in a way that surprised the driver with the confidence of a V6-powered Thunderbird. But what made the Super Coupe truly impressive did not stop at the engine. Ford also equipped it with an electronically adjustable suspension system capable of automatically stiffening when the car entered a corner or when speed increased. In the early 1990s, that was the kind of technology many people only expected to see on European luxury cars or far more expensive performance models. And it was exactly there that it ran into its biggest wall prejudice. For many traditional Thunderbird fans, the name was tied to comfort presence and above all, the power of a V8 engine. A Thunderbird made fast by a supercharged V6 electronic suspension, and fresh engineering thinking sounded interesting on paper, but it did not connect with the nostalgic emotions many customers wanted. They were not really against technology, they just did not want technology to replace what they saw as the soul of the car. That is why today, the Thunderbird Super Coupe is more forgotten than it deserves to be. At number 6 is the 1990 to 1993 Geo Storm. In the memory of many people, Geo is often associated with basic, simple, fuel-efficient cars that were somewhat anonymous within the General Motors lineup. It was not a brand that made car enthusiasts wait in excitement. But then the Storm appeared and somehow it became a very memorable exception, or more. Unfortunately, one that should have been remembered more. At its core, the Geo Storm was an Isuzu Impulse rebadged and distributed by General Motors under the Geo brand in the United States. That meant that beneath its economy car badge, this car actually had clear Japanese roots with compact proportions, a low driving position, and a feel created for young buyers looking for an affordable coupe that was not boring. And that was the Geo Storm's greatest strength, lightweight, and agile handling. But Geo was a brand that existed for far too short a time to build a strong emotional legacy. When the brand disappeared, cars like the Storm almost lost their identity in the public eye as well. But there was also another more practical reason most Geo Storms were never treated like collectibles. They were bought to be driven modified, pushed to their limits, and eventually discarded when their usefulness ran out. Very few people in the early 1990s looked at a Geo Storm and thought this was something worth preserving for the future. That is why today, the Geo Storm has almost become a faint shadow in the history of affordable American sport compacts. At number 7 is the 1993 to 1997 Mazda MX-6. It was one of the most beautiful, balanced, and refined coupes Mazda ever sold in the United States during the 1990s. What made the MX-6 interesting was that it was not the kind of car that tried to attract attention through extremism. It was not eccentric like the Subaru SVX, not rebellious like the Talon TSi, and it did not rely on an overly dramatic brand story. On the contrary, the MX-6 almost always appeared with a calm presence. Its body was low compact and well-proportioned, with clean and elegant lines that were unmistakably Mazda. It was the kind of coupe that became more beautiful the longer you looked at it, rather than the kind that burst onto the scene demanding attention. Beneath that restrained exterior was one of the car's greatest highlights, a 2.5-liter V6, a small engine but an exceptionally smooth one. At the time, it was one of the most memorable small-displacement V6 engines in its segment. It did not deliver the aggressive feel of the turbo models of the era, but instead won drivers over in its own way, smooth, sweet, rounded, and more upscale than expected. Every time you got on the throttle, the MX-6 did not give you the explosive sensation of a street racer, but rather the refined feel of a coupe tuned for the driver to enjoy harmony. That was also what made the MX-6 different from its platform sibling, the Ford Probe. The two cars shared the same basic structure, but while the Probe often carried a younger, bolder, and somewhat more Americanized image, the MX-6 felt like a more mature, softer, and more tasteful version. Mazda did not turn it into a showpiece. They turned it into a coupe with depth. But that very refinement also pushed the MX-6 into a very difficult place in the public memory. In the 1990s, when people talked about Mazda, most of the attention was focused on two much larger icons. On one side was the RX-7, the performance coupe with its glamorous and full-of-character rotary engine. On the other was the Miata, the tiny roadster that nearly redefined affordable driving fun. Caught between those two enormous shadows, the MX-6 almost had no chance to become an icon, even though it was itself an extremely well-developed car. At number 8 is the 1990 to 1998 Talon TSi. To understand why the Talon TSi was special, you first have to mention the name Diamond Star Motors, the joint venture between Chrysler and Mitsubishi. This was one of the most interesting partnerships in the auto industry at the time, and from that alliance came a legendary trio, the Mitsubishi Eclipse Plymouth Laser and Eagle Talon. But among them, the Talon always carried its own distinct character. It looked sharper, meaner, and to many enthusiasts also cooler. The TSi version was where the story truly started to get serious. Under the hood was the turbocharged 4G63 engine, one of the most famous turbocharged four-cylinder engines in the history of Japanese performance cars. Combined with AWD, the Talon TSi was no longer just a good-looking sport coupe. It became a real weapon, especially in the drag and street performance world of the early 1990s. When the turbo came on boost and all four wheels pulled the car forward, the Talon delivered a brutally aggressive sense of acceleration, very different from many front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive coupes of the same era. And that is exactly why the speed crowd remembers it with special respect. The Talon TSi did not need a big engine to create fear. It used turbocharging, reasonable weight, all-wheel drive, and nearly endless tuning potential. In the right hands, this was the kind of car that could become a nightmare for many more expensive rivals. It was a product of a time when automakers still dared to release bold configurations for true driving enthusiasts before everything became too safe, too uniform, or too dependent on marketing image. But in the end, the brand itself also became Talon's fatal weakness. Eagle never had a heritage foundation as strong as Mitsubishi or even Plymouth. It was a brand that existed somewhat faintly in the minds of the general public. And when Eagle was discontinued in 1998, the Talon name was almost buried with it. While the Mitsubishi Eclipse continued to live on in public memory, the Eagle Talon gradually came to be seen as a less famous sibling, even though in essence, it shared the same very impressive performance bloodline. At number 9 is the 1991 Isuzu Impulse RS Turbo. The words "handling by Lotus" alone were enough to make this car stand out. In the automotive world, Lotus had long been a symbol of chassis tuning and driving feel, and with the Impulse RS Turbo, Isuzu used exactly that magic to turn a small coupe into a machine with agility far beyond what most people would imagine. This was not the kind of car that was only strong in a straight line. It was the kind of car that let the driver clearly feel every change in the road surface, every change of direction, every moment the body clung tightly through a corner. Its appeal also lay in a configuration that was rare in the early 1990s. A turbocharged engine combined with AWD gave the Impulse RS Turbo a very special character, compact, grippy, agile, and ready to surprise. But what truly pushed this car into the realm of forgotten legend was its rarity. In the United States, only about 800 Impulse RS Turbos were sold. That number was so small that even in its own time, this was already a car many people had never seen in person. It never had the chance to become a familiar name to the masses, nor did it have enough time to build a mainstream legacy. And then the biggest reason it was forgotten arrived very quickly. Isuzu withdrew from the US passenger car market to focus on SUVs and trucks. When the brand no longer continued telling its story in the passenger car segment, special models like the Impulse RS Turbo were left behind as well. That is what makes the Isuzu Impulse RS Turbo valuable today. At number 10 is the 1991 to 1994 Mercury Capri. At first glance, the Capri had everything it needed to succeed. It was a 2+2 convertible with a youthful, cheerful design and was more approachable than many of the expensive sports cars of the same era. More importantly, it did not follow the pure roadster formula of the Mazda Miata. The Capri was developed in a more practical direction, front-wheel drive, easier for the masses to drive, and with a small rear seat to add everyday usability. The origin of this car was also quite interesting. Although it wore the American Mercury brand, the Capri was actually imported from Australia, giving it an identity that was slightly offbeat compared with the rest of Ford's lineup at the time. That made it feel both familiar and unusual, familiar enough to appeal to American buyers, yet different enough not to blend completely into the crowd. On the road, the Mercury Capri delivered a pleasant and friendly experience. It was not as sharp as a rear-wheel drive sports car, but it offered a light, agile, and practical character that many mainstream convertible buyers could appreciate. This was the kind of car for people who wanted the feeling of open-air driving, wanted a youthful look, but did not necessarily want to give up everyday convenience. The problem was that at exactly that moment, the Mazda Miata had already done too good a job of becoming an icon. The Miata was not just a successful convertible, it almost redefined the entire small convertible sports car segment with a formula that was simply too perfect, lightweight, rear-wheel drive, balance, fun-to-drive character, and full of classic spirit. Against a rival with such a clear identity, the Mercury Capri was overshadowed. It was more practical but less exciting. It was easier to live with but also less emotional. And in the world of convertibles, emotion is often what decides which car gets remembered. Looking back at this entire list, the biggest thing these cars had in common was not speed or rarity, but the courage to experiment with new ideas at a time when the market was not ready to embrace them. They were once seen as strange, unconventional, or simply out of step with mainstream taste, but that is exactly what has made them more valuable over time. Today, many of these models are gradually becoming true collectibles, not only because they are rare, but because they represent a very special, bold era in the automotive industry. And you, out of these 10 cars, have you ever owned or driven any of them? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to get the newest videos first.